We went to Sardinia. The place in Sardinia we were at was actually the epicenter of the first blue zone ever identified. It was not only in Sardinia, it was actually in the same village. What we experienced there was the exact opposite from a food perspective as what's portrayed as typical of the blue zones. You'd be hard pressed to find a vegetable at most of these meals. Like they existed, but as side pieces. Every time we sat down at a table, somebody was so proud. They brought out a whole bunch of their homemade cheeses and a whole bunch of their cured meats. Literally, if you went to a house in another part of the world, they bring out a bag of potato chips or cheese and crackers. It was meat and cheese, literally every single place that we went. They're not only things that somebody in their home maybe could decide to adopt to feed their family, they become the mandate for schools and for hospitals and for prisons. Again, we're talking about populations that could absolutely benefit from smart, healthy choices. So it's more than just misreporting. It's literally ruining lives and putting structures in place that are going to take us years or decades to crawl out of. And meanwhile, people are suffering. So from a food perspective, it was literally the exact opposite of what's being portrayed. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was that extravagantly different.
Bill, if you had to pick one ancestral processing technique for us in the West these days to use to make our food safer and more nutritious, what would it be?
I'll say fermentation. And the reason I'll say fermentation is because every single traditional diet in the world is based on fermentation. And fermentation is the core of not only those diets, but the processing of just about every raw material. So, and it really is the basis for our favorite foods even today, at least when they're made traditionally. So obviously vegetables can be fermented into things like sauerkraut and kimchi and the like. Milk is fermented into the best cheeses in the world, kefir, yogurt, clabber, those sorts of things. Meat is fermented into things like true, real, genuine salamis. Flours are obviously fermented into things like sourdough, but also it's the core of the highest quality chocolate in the world. It's one of the processing steps is fermentation. The highest quality coffees in the world have fermentation as a part of the processing. We're headed to Brazil actually next month. To the whole family is, believe it or not, Christina has agreed that our 25th wedding anniversary is going to be spent in the Amazon with the whole family, and we're learning about traditional manioc processing, which is an incredibly poisonous root that when processed properly then becomes things like tapioca, which is, I'm sure, in the diets of many of the people listening to this. So fermentation is incredibly powerful and a necessary step in the detoxification in so many vegetables, but is also important in the animal world as well.
To me, there's two different aspects to this. One, unlocking nutrition and becoming more nutritious from, say, a baseline. And then two, when it comes to plants, the toxins, hopefully nullifying those or knocking those down. But what I want to hone in on is chocolate and oxalates. I know that's a high oxalate food. When it comes to fermentation and otherwise, have we been able to knock the oxalate content down with any of that processing?
Not substantially, unfortunately. All the research that I've seen, I found, I think at this point, it's 3 peer-reviewed articles that were focused on using fermentation to try to lower the oxalate content of foods. And in all of the cases, the oxalate content reduced, but by the end of the article, by the end of the presentation of the findings, the authors in every case said not in any significant amount. Like it wasn't worth the trouble in terms of oxalate. So let me just very quickly say the only reason I paused at the beginning when you said which processing technique is because I was going to say butchering because of a whole bunch of wonderful aspects of butchering and such a nutrient-dense, bioavailable by itself resource as soon as you get into the animal and the connection it can afford anybody today. But truly for the role of transforming a raw ingredient that we literally in most cases have no business eating with our really truly human inefficient digestive tracts, transforming it into its safer and more bioavailable, more nutrient-dense form. Fermentation really is it. But you did mention there's limitations for sure. Oxalates are, there are things that look like they can help with oxalates, right? If we still have all the natural bacteria in our guts that we were born with, if we were born in a healthy situation, there's bacteria there that seem to help. If there's some suggestions, obviously, that if we cook certain high oxalate containing foods with dairy. The calcium can bind to the oxalate and it becomes a little bit less impactful on us. But the reality is, at this point, at least where I stand from my view of not only looking at the modern science, but also looking at traditional approaches to food and where these different foods have been in our diets in the past, and the role of technology and detoxification of something like an oxalate, my biggest suggestion is to just minimize the high oxalate containing foods in our diets. And I know for some people that sounds, oh my gosh, one more thing that I have to worry about, one more thing that I have to track. The reality is, if all you did was eat seasonally, you would accomplish 90% of what you'd have to in order to accomplish that goal. I mean, literally, again, eating, and I've said this so many times, and we maybe even spoke about it in the past, spinach is one of the worst offenders when it comes to oxalates. I myself, because I have such an issue with oxalates, will never intentionally have spinach again for the rest of my life. But is spinach itself inherently a bad thing? Not necessarily, if you eat it when it's in season. If you consider it a superfood and think you need it every single day and go to the grocery store and get it every single day and it's frozen in fresh form and eat spinach salads and make spinach smoothies and all this, you can create a huge problem. But it's a problem that only exists because of the modern industrial food system and taking the seasons out of the grocery store. But if all you did was eat seasonally, a healthy human that doesn't have an oxalate toxicity issue could have spinach in their diet as a part of a healthy diet. I'm convinced, because you'd only have it for a few weeks out of the year in your diet every year.
And then to further expand on that, what I think you're getting at there is having these breaks where your body can clear it out of the system, which in our modern world, when we can get it, 24/7, 365, we don't necessarily have that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the other issues I think that's happening with our modern approach to food. And I see it in a number of different ways. We find so many of us are in such poor metabolic health, and much of that poor metabolic health is a result of a lifetime of poor diets. Anytime we make a change, most of the time when we make a change in our diet, we see some improvement in our metabolic health. And then we get into this false sense of security where we say, okay, all of a sudden, that is it. Whatever I just did just healed me a little bit. And if I do it more, it's going to heal me even more. And if I need to continue it for the rest of my life. And I believe in most cases, that's not the path that we should be on. We force ourselves into thinking just because this one little change made a difference, then we have to stay on that path the rest of our life. And one of the issues is we stick to a potential diet that might not be the healthiest for us overall. It just helped us accomplish that first goal, whether it be weight loss or digestive issues or whatever. And then once that situation has been dealt with, the next thing that's underlying pops up. And sometimes we have to make a shift in our diet. But the other problem is when, some people, maybe they go keto, which I love. I think a ketogenic approach is an incredible approach, but they do it in a certain way, and they maybe just eat eggs and just eat this and just eat this. And then all of a sudden what they've done is, they've gone on a ketogenic diet or whatever dietary path they're on, but they've excluded a ton of diversity in their diet, in their particular diet. Even though they might be low carb and experiencing incredible weight loss because of that, there's a lot of diversity that, because of their narrow approach to that diet, that they're overlooking. So, the same sort of a thing. We start eating seasonally, right? We force diversity back into our diet. And there's a ton of other benefits as well, but we force that diversity back in. And that not only manifests in a bunch of different nutrients and different forms coming into our body. It helps with boredom. It helps with a lot of different things, but it also helps even out some of those issues. We might have a little bit of a higher oxalate diet for these few weeks, and then it goes away and our bodies can help to recover. And we, again, have created some of these issues just because of the lack of seasonality in our diets.
As you talk about diversity, it gets me thinking about our past, and you're the perfect person to hone in on this as an archaeologist. How diverse was our diet through the ages?
It's, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult to pinpoint exactly what somebody's diet was over a year and how diverse it was, especially the further back in time we go. So we do have really good resolution, really clear resolution on several things. Like we can find what we call coprolites, which is literally fossilized human poop. and we can find coprolites, and we can literally identify what somebody's last meal was by looking at that, right? Which is great, but that's only a snapshot. That tells you one meal. We can sometimes, like in the case of Uzzi, that we in the Italian, in the Alps, that we found the stomach contents, and could not only tell what the last meal was, but because of some of the plants that were in Uzzi's gut, we were able to tell what direction he had come from. You know, what he was traveling in. I mean, it's amazing. We can tell when meat first entered our diet at 3.4 million years ago. There's a ton of things we can tell, but to be able to say they ate this and this and this and this and this is incredibly difficult. But what the archaeological record suggests is that there was a ton of diversity in our diets. And obviously people by default had to eat seasonally, especially the further back in time we go and the less sort of long-term preservation was going on. Plus, up until the agricultural revolution, which starts in different parts of the world between 10 and 15,000 years ago, we're convinced that practically all of our ancestors, no matter where they were in the world or when they were in the world, for millions of years were fully nomadic, which meant they were picking up and moving on a regular basis. So people that are picking up and moving on a regular basis, especially well prior to the development of the wheel or beast of burden like a horse or a donkey or anything like this, meant that everything that they had, they carried with them. And you don't accumulate a lot of things. Now we're all sedentary. We have houses, we have storage units, and we just load them and we become hoarders. But that was impossible to do in the deep past. So not only aren't you carrying a lot of things with you, but you're not carrying a lot of food with you as well, which means there's not a lot of, you're not eating, even if though they have have mastered in many cases for a very long period of time something like fermentation, which does bring with it a long-term sort of storage capability. That doesn't mean they're carrying around jugs of sauerkraut across the landscape for months out of the year. So seasonality it was incredibly important. My estimation and the way when I taught college classes on this, the way I used to present it is we think that on a, and again, to talk about 3.5 million years worth of time and diets, we're overlooking a massive amount of diversity. So millions of years worth of time, different geographic regions, different access to resources and technologies and ways of doing things. But in general, I estimate that we had hundreds of different plants and dozens of different animals in our diets in a given year. And that, if you think about, even if you are one of the most health conscious people in the world right now, and let's say you're a full omnivore, what can you really say you have in your diet on a regular basis? You probably have 3 animals, right? You probably have beef, pork, and chicken. And you probably have a dozen vegetables in your diets on a rotating basis. And even though, and just think about it this way, and this way I used to tell my students, how many of you eat salad? You know, I'd say, how many of you eat salads every single day? And a whole bunch of very, very proud students, raise your hands, I do. They're great. Go downstairs and look at the salad bar today. How many vegetable options are there? And this is the dining hall at the college. And we had a pretty decent dining hall at Washington College. So go downstairs, they have about 12 different vegetables. And then I said, okay, look next month and look next month. And then look during the spring semester, they are the exact same 12 vegetables every single day. So even if you load your plate with every vegetable option in the dining hall every single day of the year, you're getting the same 12 vegetables. So I do think there was a lot of diversity in our diets in the past. And again, even for us health-conscious consumers and eaters today, we're overlooking a lot of that diversity.
I want to highlight what you brought up, and it makes a lot of sense. We're trying to squeeze millions of years into a general answer here, and that's impossible. So we're doing the best we can. And I want to highlight that before bringing up my next question. And you've talked about the diversity piece now of plants and animals. I'm curious, looking at these last poops and such, do you feel plants were a survival food, or were they sought after to complement the meat, even in a time of abundance when meat was there?
Again, that's so incredibly hard to answer. But I'll tell you what my perspective is on it. And I'm going to give you an example of something very quickly, too. My perspective is, first off, we were eating plants for millions of years before the first bite of meat our ancestors ever had their first bite of meat, period. And we know this. We were eating wild vegetation and wild fruits and a whole bunch of insects for millions of years before we ever had our first bite of meat. And then we're eating plants and meat for about 1.5 million years before we started eating the entirety of the animal, and we started hunting it 2 million years ago. And we still, for this entire time, we were eating a massive amount of insects, a massive amount of animals, and plants continued to be in our diet. The only time we see plants essentially absent from our diet is in the Arctic during the majority of the year when there was no access to plants whatsoever. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be any intentional elimination of plants in our diet. The question, however, is why were plants in our diet, and what did we do to make sure that they were there in our diets in the healthiest and most nourishing form possible, right? Because we know that they're there. So here's a couple of great examples. There was a find years ago. They were looking at the dental calculus of Neanderthals. Neanderthals were not our ancestors. They were our contemporaries. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted on Earth for over 200,000 years. And we know for sure now that they actually created offspring together. And there's Neanderthal genes in modern human populations now. But for hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals were living side by side with humans. And they were looking at the dental calculus. In other words, the stuff that when you go to the dentist, they scrape off of those metal tools, that stuff they weren't getting scraped off in the past. So they were looking at that on Neanderthal finds. And they found plants, the remains of plants in this dental calculus in the form of what we call phytoliths, these little plant rocks, in the dental calculus. And these were plants that looked incredibly difficult. There was no way that our digestive tract could break them down and get any sort of nutrition from them whatsoever. So then they were wondering, well, why were they even consuming these plants? Maybe they were using them for medicine. Maybe they were using them for hallucinogenic property. We didn't know, but it definitely wasn't for a nutritional reason, because our digestive tract could not efficiently break these plants down to derive nutrition from them. And then somebody else finally came up with a brilliant idea, and I think this is exactly where it was. These Neanderthals were eating reindeer, and the plants they were finding the remains of on their teeth were actually they were actually reindeer food. They were plants that reindeer can actually digest properly and derive nutrition from. But what the Neanderthals were doing was they were actually eating the chyme, the stomach contents and the small intestinal contents from these reindeer that still had the remains of these plants in them. And to me, that's the best way to get nutrition, and the most efficient way to get nutrition from the outside world into the human body is to allow an animal that is perfectly designed to break it down fully, and then get it before they turn it into muscle and fat and milk and all the other things. So they were eating this, and this is still done by some populations today. They were eating the stomach contents of these animals, and they saw the remains on the teeth. So when we see plants in the diet in our ancestors, it's a very complex situation we have to try to figure out, right? In interpretation. So in some cases, they're probably eating the stomach contents and the small intestinal contents of animals that have already digested it. In other cases, they might not be consuming these plants for food. They might be, but they might be doing it for other reasons. I believe plants do have a place in our diet in the right way, but if we look at all the resources that we have available to us, the most nutrient-dense, bioavailable, safe nutrition comes from animal sources and should be the foundation of our diets. Plants, we should look at plants and consider them in our diets for entertainment and health reasons. I mean, think about it. What do we do with plants? Well, with plants, we make alcohol. This doesn't suggest we should drink alcohol or not, but what do we do with plants? We turn it into alcohol. It's entertainment. Much of it is turned into drugs. That's entertainment. Drugs, I mean like recreational drugs. A lot of it is turned into medicine, and it makes complete sense because the very toxins that we're worried about when we ingest these plants are the same toxins that make cinnamon taste like cinnamon and make cloves taste like cloves, right? So we use these things for medicine, we use them for spices, we use them for all of these different reasons, and we also use them for poison. So poison, medicine, entertainment, and some nutrition. That's the role that plants play in our diet. And to suggest that our ancestors were not consuming them is false, but to suggest that we should have a diet based on plants is a novel thing in the history of humanity. And if you're going to do it, there's a lot of steps you need to take to make sure you're doing it in the healthiest way possible.
Okay. So it sounds like we're clear that they can be useful in a handful of different realms that you just mentioned. But when it comes to our history in trying to de-entangle whether or not plants were being used as nutrition, as calories, other than survival, still unsure then.
Yeah, I mean,
because to me,
go ahead.
Let me just add to that. When we eat plants, we're likely going to produce more feces, which if we're in survival mode and we're pooping all over the plains and different animals are smelling that and tracking us, I could be wrong, but that's what comes to mind. And just the calorie density, the nutrition density, yeah, the toxins that we've started to talk about, we're going to go deeper into. There's so many hangups that, from my lay perspective on all this, it would be hard to imagine if somebody has access to meat, they're going to lug around some fermented vegetables other than as a backup.
Again, it's really hard. It's so incredibly hard to say and to interpret, but here's another way to think about it. And again, it's so hard. I don't want to say somebody was doing this, because even if I was right, if I was like, this group 25,000 years ago in this part of the world was doing this, that doesn't mean another group the same time or another group 50,000 years earlier was doing the same thing. I mean, there is a ton of diversity. The other thing I would say real quickly about fermentation before we move on, and I continue this, is fermentation checks a lot of boxes. It solves a lot of problems in our relationship with our natural resources, especially when it comes to plants. Number one, it is an incredible detoxifier. It can help, can't detoxify all toxins in plants. There are other things that can detoxify other problems, but it does do a great job with detoxification of certain things. It does a great job of increasing the bioavailability of nutrients. In other words, our bodies have to work less hard to access the same amount or even more nutrients from that raw material. It helps increase the shelf life. But the other part of this, and this is where a lot of our reconstruction of prehistoric diets and our understanding of traditional diets, I think, is lacking. We have a sense of smell and a sense of taste and ability to see and ability to feel for very important reasons. And we enjoy food when it's nourishing. We enjoy food when it tastes right. We enjoy food when it smells right. And fermentation can help improve flavor. It can help improve the aroma. It can help improve the texture of these foods, which were just as important to our ancestors as they are to us today. So fermentation is a catch-all across the board. But I am hesitant to try to fully make a statement about how plants played a role in our diets in the past, because if I even was right for one group, I'd be wrong for others, and it would be a lie. I just think that we need to think about it much more holistically than we do. But I do need to, and this is coming from somebody who's been on a carnivore diet several times, and I think that it is a fantastic approach for solving certain issues in our diets. Our ancestors were not carnivores. Our ancestors were never carnivores. Our ancestors have been omnivores for the entirety that we've been on this planet, and that they have been on this planet. That plants have been in our diets the entire time, and for whatever role they served, and so have insects. Insects have been in our diets the entire time too, and nobody wants to talk about that, but they've been in the entirety. What I can say is that looking at modern living or extant traditional groups today can help with some of these interpretations and look at the role that plants play in diet today. Now, the problem is most indigenous or traditional groups today have been pushed through modernization, have been pushed, cities pop up. One reason that if you went to any city in the world, just about any city in the world that has any history in it whatsoever, Underneath the current city is an older city. Underneath that city is an older city. Underneath that is a prehistoric occupation. Underneath that is tens of thousands of years of occupation, because that location was amazing. It's where the confluence of two rivers came together. It was rich in something over here. It was rich in this natural resource over here. I mean, other than somewhere like Las Vegas, which, they have to pump all the natural resources into Las Vegas, but real genuine cities with history have a ton of history and prehistory underneath it. And what happens is, where the best lands, the best hunting lands, the best natural resources for a lot of these traditional and indigenous groups have been taken over by modernization, and they've been pushed to the outskirts. So even though one of the things that I love to do and find a lot of value in is to go into these societies and see how they're eating and how they're cooking and what they're doing with their resources, their resource base now is nowhere near what it was 12,000 years ago, because they've been pushed to the margins. They've been pushed to the land that the farmers and the industry doesn't want. And their ability to hunt and their ability to live the same life that they lived in the past has been hindered. But there's still a ton of valuable information. And the thing I'll say is, when I talk about plants in the diet, it's not like walking through the grocery store or even a farmer's market and grabbing carrots and grabbing broccoli and taking bites of it, because first of all, we're talking about hyper-seasonal, hyper-local plants. We're talking about wild plants, and we're talking about a massive amount of toxins that need to be dealt with efficiently and successfully. And also, even though the nutrition that's in these plants has to become bioavailable for our bodies to even have access to it, and that requires some sort of processing.
You quickly touched on wild plants there at the end, and that's an important distinction we make here. The fact that the fruits and vegetables we're buying at the grocery store or the farmer's market, and you can clarify this, a lot of them, if not all of them, have been changed a lot from their wild forms.
Every single one of them. So for whatever number of wild plants there are in the outside world, only a very, very small percentage of them ever became food for our ancestors, or even food for those of us today that are still foraging and dealing with wild plants. And only a fraction of those plants lent themselves to some sort of domestication, where in early years through selective pressure, but later on nowadays through chemistry, we're genetically modifying these plants to produce a certain outcome. Rarely is the genetic mutations that are taking place now focused on making something healthier. It's usually focused on things like making it sweeter, or making the seeds smaller, or making the fruits bigger, or actually, let me grab something real quick. Hold on, it's right here.
Sounds good.
I have a nixtamalization and maize class this weekend, so I had stuff out. This is even an heirloom cob of maize. Here is an ancestral cob of maize, and I don't know if you can see it, but do you see the difference between this and modern corn or modern maize?
Yeah, and I know from your work, each kernel is individually wrapped there.
Each kernel is individually wrapped. So one of the genetic mutations that took place in the domestication of maize was, and most grains are like this, like a wheat grain as everyone. Imagine if somebody gave you this and said, your parents gave you this and said, shuck this, and then we're going to put corn on the top. Like, you'd be out there all day long. So the decisions that people are making when they're putting plants through domestication is for things like somebody making more money or a consumer's palate to be happy with it. It's not necessarily because it has more vitamins or more protein or more something like this in it. And usually it's at the expense of the nutrients. There's an amazing book called...
we can link it up if you think
we can link it up. I remember it. It's a fantastic book about the destruction of nutrients in plants through the domestication, and Eating on the Wild Side. That's the name of the book, Eating on the Wild Side. And every chapter is divided into a different food, like apples and garlic and whatever. But the example is, right now, an apple today has between a half and a third the nutrition of an apple that our parents would have had access to. It's sweeter, it has more calories, it has more carbohydrates, but it has less nutrition in it. So we have to eat 2 apples and get all the carbohydrates and all the other sugars and things with it on top of it to even come close to the nutrients that our parents got when they ate an apple. And that's happening throughout our food system.
And how do you feel about that domestication? Because to me, it sounds like, hearing you talk, there's pros and cons. whether it be more sugar, that's a bad thing, less nutrition, a bad thing, but we've made the food more accessible. But what I want to get into is the interaction with our biology. How new is this? Because we were talking millions of years before that our biology has interacted with these different nutrients and foods, and even dismissing the things like blood sugar, nutrients, because this food is so new to us in the timeline of history. I don't hear a lot of people talking about that engagement of the actual food with our biology.
Well, it's a really good point. And let me answer that in two ways. First, the reason that we're going, this is, I think, a really good example. I think the domestication of these plants has been really one of the worst things that's ever happened in the history of our diets, period. I mean, if you look at, and we might have mentioned it before, but if anybody's interested in a really short, powerful read, it's dated, it's a couple decades old, but Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel and the book Collapse, he's an incredible author. He wrote a very short article called The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race. You can Google it. There's PDFs of it all over the place. It's only about 4 or 5 pages long, but it's a powerful article. And I've assigned it in almost every college class I've ever taught. And it sparks a lot of discussion and reframes the way we think about the development of agriculture. And the whole thesis is pretty much, if our ancestors knew what they were doing when they started domesticating plants, they would have dropped their hoes and their plows or whatever and run in the other direction. But the other things that come up through this article, and this is well known in the anthropological space, is that with the development of agriculture comes a whole lot of other things. In addition to problems in our diets and in our health, a lot of other things happen as a result of it that most of us see as negative things. So number one, the development of social hierarchy starts with the development of agriculture. The disconnection from our food and where it comes from begins with the development of agriculture. There's no evidence anywhere in the world of organized warfare ever before the development of agriculture. And this continues and continues on. And I know some of this might come as a surprise to some people, and you're like, what the hell is he talking about? But when you start to understand how these things all link together, it makes a lot of sense. But one of the other things that happens with the development of agriculture is, as we're breeding these plants, one of the things we breed away from these plants, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but bear with me for a minute. One of the things we breed out of these plants are their own natural defense mechanisms. So we take wild plants, and if you think about, you're trying to kill dandelions in your yard, or you think about the weeds that keep coming up through the cracks in your sidewalk, and you're spending half your summer trying to get rid of these wild plants, and the other half of your summer in your garden in the backyard doing everything you can to keep the plants you want growing, and they're getting attacked by all sorts of other insects and they're or disease or fungus or whatever. I mean, think about what's happening here. These wild plants are perfectly designed to defend themselves. Like, if you put the dandelion seeds in the ground, you put 100 dandelion seeds in the ground, you're going to have 100 dandelion plants in your yard, no matter what, in almost all cases. But you plant 100 tomato plants in your backyard, you'd be lucky if you get a percentage of them to come up and produce fruit. So when we're going to the Amazon to work with traditional processors of manioc. Manioc is an incredibly, incredibly toxic root. It has cyanide-producing compounds. It kills people every year still today. But this plant is heavily processed. It goes through a fermentation stage and a drying stage and a whole bunch of things that I can't wait to witness and be a part of. But once it's finished, it becomes tapioca and a couple other things. But tapioca flour is made from this incredibly poisonous manioc root that has to be processed. Now, the crazy thing is, we have figured out how to genetically manipulate this and create something we call sweet manioc. And if you go to a really high-end grocery store or one of these off-the-wall grocery stores, you can actually buy something called sweet manioc, which has a much lower toxin load. And in fact, all you have to do is cook it, and you detoxify to the point that it becomes safe and edible. But even though these traditional groups have access to the sweet version of this, the less toxic version of this, they intentionally decide every single year to continue to plant and harvest the most poisonous version of this. And the reason is because they don't have to worry about it. They put it in the field and they get 100% amazing yield because it has all the natural defense mechanisms, which to us are toxins. And they're also, keep the insects away and the disease and the fungus. And then they process it after the fact. The processing is incredibly, incredibly important. But what we've done with most of the modern plants, and you're asking about the benefits and the cons, we have stripped these plants. Now, we haven't eliminated all these toxins. There's still a problem for us, especially when we eat high amounts of them or don't process them properly. But we've stripped them of their natural defense mechanisms. So here we go, plant them in a field, and we have to hit them with all sorts of insecticides and fungicides and herbicides to make sure, artificially, we're putting it back into it. We're destroying the planet. We're making ourselves sick from it. And then we put it in the grocery store, and they're just low enough on the toxic load level that most of us aren't thinking about it. And we just go ahead and eat as many potatoes as we want, not even thinking that they're still loaded with glycoalkaloids, just not as much as their ancestral version. So we're disconnected enough. These things are just safe enough. It's not on our radar to process them properly. They're defenseless, so we have to hit it with all sorts of artificial things in the field. And it's a lose-lose situation all the way across. So even though I don't eat a ton of vegetables, I do still eat plants. I process them properly. I'm very selective about what I eat. I still love to teach foraging classes because when you go foraging, you're tuned into all of these things at the same time. First of all, the localness and the seasonality are literally right in your face, but also the idea that, these plants have toxins. And if we're going to consume them, we have to eat them at this time of the year. We have to do these sorts of things to them to make them as safe as they can be. And we have to process them this way to unlock the nutrients that they have inside. And I wish... I'm not trying to talk anybody out of eating vegetables whatsoever, but just as much as if you eat meat, I'm convinced you should at least butcher an animal once or take a butchering class or be there to understand it and connect with it. If you eat vegetables, then I highly advise taking a foraging class sometime and connecting on that level as well, even if you're only going to buy vegetables at the grocery store.
I love that example of the tomato and the dandelion. And I've never thought about it that way, where, dandelions, we can't get rid of them. And our tomato plant, if we leave and go away for a weekend and don't water it, we're likely going to come back and it's going to be keeled over. They're just so weak and they've been bred this way intentionally. So now that I have this new perspective, it's almost comical what we've done.
Yeah, and we do it literally. I've done it in the same day. When I used to keep a garden, I would spend half the day weeding and the other half trying to tend to these other plants.
Well, let's bring it to meat, because I think a lot of times when it comes to this conversation of domestication, plants get picked on and meat gets pushed aside and we don't go there. So let's bring in the modern cow, chickens, pigs. How different are these foods from our ancestral past?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm really, really, really glad you brought it up. So one of the big differences, I would say right away, is that you named the three main ones. I mean, truly, what you didn't even name was the most popular meat in the world is goat. And it's hardly in anybody's diet in America. So, but realistically, pigs, chickens, and cows are the main meat sources in the modern American diet if we're eating meat. And we've, in some cases, because of a couple different factors, have demonized some of that, right? The pig has been demonized for a few reasons. There's several books that talk about meat and really push the pork aside for a variety of reasons. And I found out after the fact some of them were for religious reasons and had nothing to do with health. But we've also, because of the way most chickens in this country are raised, a lot of people have pushed chicken aside as well. And I completely understand that. So for most health conscious, meat consuming people in this country, beef is the turn to, right? So even if beef was magical, and I love beef, do not get me wrong, beef, I absolutely love beef, and beef is probably represents the most amount of meat in my diet on a yearly basis. I mean, there's times of the year when we're eating mostly venison and times of the year we're eating other things, but beef overall is probably the most consumed meat in my family. The fact that we're honing in on one meat source is new. Like, that is not ancestral. That is not, I mean, if you're making decisions about your diet, And the foundation of those decisions are I'm trying to eat an ancestrally appropriate diet. I don't care how good the meat source is. Eating one source of meat is not ancestrally appropriate. Now, also, please do understand that cows were not around 30,000 years ago, right? So the fact that it's domesticated means it's new within the past. If animals are concerned, 8 to 10,000 years, but it is new. Not necessarily does that mean it's good or bad, but it is new. And there's a lot of nuances here as well because, for example, we eat a lot of beef, we eat a lot of pork, and we eat some chicken. The problem with chicken is, of the three, high quality chicken to me is the hardest thing to source in most parts of this country. We can get chicken everywhere, but high quality chicken is one of the hardest things to source. We eat a lot of venison, and some people would say, "Oh my God, that's amazing because venison is a wild meat and it's eating a wild diet." Well, yeah, but I live out here on the eastern shore of Maryland. There are cornfields everywhere, and almost every one of these cornfields is loaded with GMO corn, sprayed with all kinds of nasty things. And I hunt those fields, or I hunt areas around these fields. And all of my venison, all of my venison here that I shoot, that I eat, is corn finished. I mean, it literally spends the last at least weeks of its life eating GMO corn. So it's not as easy to say, I'm asking the question. I don't know. Is a grass-fed, grass-finished, well-raised cow a better source of meat than a wild deer that finished its life on GMO corn that's sprayed with all sorts of nonsense? I don't know that answer, but the reason I'm even bringing it up is because it is an incredibly complicated discussion that is larger than sound bites on an Instagram thing that most people end up saying. The other part of that is the issue. One thing that I'm starting to try to figure out on my own as well is, what about that fat piece? I love animal fat. I think it's one of the most incredible sources of nutrition. I think we should have a very high fat diet, especially if we're low carb. But domesticated animals carry more fat on them than most wild animals do. Now, that said, when we look at the way traditional groups today access nutrition from their animals that they harvest, and we're confident, we even see it in the archaeological record, they are eating all of the animal and also breaking open the bones and extracting the marrow on the inside. So it doesn't matter even how lean an animal is. It doesn't matter what time of the year the animal's been killed. Those bones are still loaded with marrow. An animal will die of starvation before it depletes its marrow resources. So for those people, and I bring this up because some people have suggested to me, well, heck, that's fine. But if you're in equatorial Africa and you're hunting these animals and they're lean and they're not eating all the same amount of fat that you're getting on a cow in America, I would disagree, because they are not only eating all the visceral fat, but they're also eating all the subcutaneous fat. They're also breaking up the bones for marrow. And we also have evidence for boiling the bones. And the other source of fat in an animal is what we call bone grease. And we know people were doing this around the world and continue to do so. So when you put a bone, and anybody who's made bone broth knows this, if you put bones and you make bone broth in water and you cook it long enough, you have a layer of fat that comes up off the top. Even if all you put in that pot was bones, you have fat that comes to the top. And that fat actually comes from the walls of the bones, the matrix of the bones, and that's called bone grease. And we know that was important to our ancestors as well.
As we're talking about deer and eating corn from the fields, it gets me thinking about different diets of animals that have been domesticated. And we have our grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And the difference there between, say, a monogastric, like a pig or a chicken, is that they process grains if they're being fed an inappropriate diet. Obviously, the best is to get an animal that's fed the correct diet for the animal and for us.
Absolutely.
But I want to highlight the point that if we're going to eat beef, because of the 4 chambers in the stomach, the end product of that beef is very different if it's being fed an inappropriate diet than chicken or pigs who are monogastric like us. And if they're being fed the wrong diet, that's when linoleic acid can spike in their food. Sorry, not in their food, in our food when we eat that meat, which could bring us into the whole linoleic acid vegetable oil piece. And there's people that say linoleic acid is bad no matter what. I'm not convinced that linoleic acid in a seed oil that's been heavily processed is the same as eating, say, pork that's had a non-appropriate diet. But there are people that kind of go both ways on that. Like linoleic acid is linoleic acid. So I've opened a lot of different pieces here. But what points I want to highlight are beef is different when we're getting beef that's fed CAFO. Again, we don't want to do that. But if we are eating that, it is different than the monogastrics who can't break down that inappropriate diet. And then their meat is very different than them eating the appropriate diet.
I 100% agree. I would also like to add, and actually, let me just very quick. The first time I professionally butchered a pig, I'd been messing around and trying to learn how to do these things myself for quite some time. But then finally, when I realized my life was going in the direction that it was, I realized I had to get professionally trained. So I went, those trainings took place at the Italian Culinary Institute in Calabria in southern Italy. And I remember when we were going through the butchering time there at the Italian Culinary Institute, we went out to this farm where they raised pigs, and they had them roaming. I mean, it looked like something from a Netflix special. I mean, it was gorgeous. They had these pigs roaming through the forest. They were eating literally olives and chestnuts. And then we picked out the pig and then harvested the pig. Then we brought the pig back to the Italian Culinary Institute, and we started butchering this. And what floored me, the biggest, thing that happened in my mind as I'm doing this is it looked like I was cutting open a cow. Like, not for the anatomy, but the color of the meat was almost the color of beef. I mean, and so I grew up in the 70s and the 80s where they were literally breeding pigs to be the other white meat. They were breeding the color and the nutrition out of pigs because everybody thought we needed to go in the direction of low-fat chicken breast sort of thing. And this pig, this heritage pig that was on an amazing diet, had pork color, the color of the best steak you've ever had in your life. It completely blew my mind. So there are drastic differences, like you mentioned, in not only the quality of the animal, but how it was raised, how it was fed. Equally important, how it was slaughtered, right? How it was killed and how it was taken apart. All of those factors play an incredibly large role in everything from the taste and the nutritional value of the final product. However, we could sit here all day and have a conversation about this is exactly what we should have and the direction that the food industry should be going in and all of that. And it's all a very important conversation. But for most people listening to this, eating nothing but grass-fed, grass-finished local beef for the rest of their life is economically impossible, right? For every day. I mean, not for an anniversary thing, but for literally every day. And what I want to make sure people understand is there are horrible things happening in the CAFO industry and the industrialized food system, no doubt. And I hope we get to a place, and I hope we get to it soon, where that's no longer a reality of our modern food system. But it currently is a reality of our modern food system. And for some people, and that is that meat from that industry is the only meat that they can afford. And if the question is between that meat or eggplant rollatini, I would choose that meat every single time. And I know it's a hard discussion to have, but people need to have it more because we have to give ourselves some grace and we have to realize where we are, what resources we have access to in whatever form that means. And in any case, meat is more nutrient dense and bioavailable and safer than vegetables are in our diet and should be the basis of our diets. And look, I'll be fully honest. The other day, I went to the grocery store after I left. I came home and it was the only grocery store that was open, and it had like the big bag of ground beef, and it is what I got, and it is what we ate at home. And it was not grass-fed, grass-finished. And I have no idea where those cows came from, the meat that it came from. It probably had 400 cows in that package. That is what I fed my family. And at that particular moment, that particular day, that's the best resource that I had available at my disposal. So I don't want people that are listening to this and say, oh, I cannot afford that. I don't have access to that every day. What am I going to do? The answer is you're going to do the best that you can. And you should be very, very proud of the steps that you've already taken to get to that place. And then when that's comfortable, take one more small step and start implementing that.
There are so many different variables, and it's almost impossible in a conversation like this to address them all. You mentioned the affordability, the ethics of these animals, how they're being treated, the look of the meat when you cut into that pig. I mentioned the linoleic acid, so you got to look at the nutrients. There's so many different pieces. But the part of what I was trying to address before is that when it comes to animals that aren't eating their species appropriate diet, because cows have 4 stomachs,
Right.
The end product is going to be better than going, even arguably, eating an organic chicken that's fed an inappropriate diet. Because the linoleic acid can be a lot higher in that just from being fed the wrong food.
I see what you're saying. And it wouldn't just be in that. I mean, across the board, the nutritional profile of all of these things are completely different. Also, one of the things people ask me all the time, I'm a very huge proponent of eating organ meats for all the reasons we mentioned earlier, for nutritional reasons, for ethical reasons, for sustainability reasons, for monetary reasons, for all these reasons. And it is ancestrally appropriate to eat the entire animal. But anytime I say something like this, there's somebody that asks me a question and says, wait, I get it, but the liver, isn't it just full of toxins? And I shouldn't eat the liver because it's full of toxins. No, the liver is not a storage house of toxins. The liver is a filter for some of the toxins that are that detoxification takes place in our bodies. But the toxins do not get stored there. If there's the toxin load in the fat of the animal is higher than the toxin load of the liver. So the toxin load of an animal is certainly something to consider, but it isn't the liver we should be demonizing. We should be looking more at things like the fat. So another point is, what is the lifestyle and diet of these animals, and what does that mean for the toxin buildup inside of this animal? And again, for somebody that eats a massive amount of animal fat, that's something I really need to consider because that's one of the storehouses of where all these toxins are. So it is incredibly important.
When you talked about bone broth, you mentioned that layer of fat from the bone that builds on top. Would you say for somebody who at this point isn't using any of the organs, chopping them all up, putting them in a pot with the bones, making bone broth would be the easiest way to get started with all this?
Absolutely. So if there's when you're doing any butchering, whether you have a pig laid out on your counter or if it's just a chicken on your kitchen counter, if there, chicken and it comes with that little package, it always kills me that it doesn't matter where we get our chickens from. That little package has always a varying amount of organs inside of it. Sometimes there's no heart. Sometimes there's 2 hearts. I mean, it's for sure it's never coming from the chicken that you have in front of you. But regardless, you have usually the neck in there, the gizzard in there, the heart in there, and the liver in there, right? So all of those things have incredible applications. But if at least you're not going to, if you're like, I'm not there yet, do not throw them away. At least throw them in your bone broth, and you're gonna be able to get some of the nutrients. And I know it sounds strange to some people. You're gonna get some, in a good way. You're gonna get some of that flavor as well. If you are of that mindset, like, what, I'm ready to dip my toes into this, but what am I gonna do with one chicken liver, this size, right? Right. So my suggestion is, if you're not going to do if you don't have anything to do with any of the organs or the neck, at least throw it in your bone broth. If you think you might do something with them, but you're either not there yet or you don't have enough to do that, I would always keep 3 containers in my freezer. 1 for the liver, 1 for the gizzards, and 1 for the heart. And I would take my chicken hearts and I'd put them in the one and the liver. And then eventually, after several weeks, I have enough liver that I'm going to make pate out of, right? Or something, whatever it is I'm going to do with it. And then I can pull it out. A fantastic gateway drug for organ meats is the heart. I mean, the heart is essentially a muscle. So from a texture perspective and a look perspective and a flavor perspective, it's not foreign to most of us. It really has a lot of the qualities that meat has. It's a little bit tougher because it gets used all the time. But that's a great, just chicken hearts are amazing. Grab a few chicken hearts, put them on a skewer, put a little something on them, salt, little fat, and throw them on the grill. Grilled chicken hearts are one of my favorite things in the world. And again, it's not going to be a foreign flavor and texture and smell to you because it's so much like the other meat. It just has more nutrients than the other meat does.
You quickly mentioned salt there. From an ancestral perspective, when did salt come on the scene? And how do you look at that as part of a healthy diet?
What we can tell from salt, and again, this is a difficult thing to interpret fully in the archaeological record, but what we can tell from some archaeological sites, and we can definitely tell from historic records, salt was incredibly sought after since anything's been recorded or anything's been left behind that we can tell from archaeological sites. So salt has always been incredibly important. So important, in fact, that people's migratory patterns, remember I mentioned earlier, they were incredibly nomadic, would often include stops to places where you could access salt, or you could trade for salt with other groups. So salt is very important. I will tell you, we just went out a few months ago. Christine and I were invited to Redmond, out in Utah, Redmond salt mines, and blown away on a number of different levels, because I always knew how important salt was, but they gave us a full deep dive lesson. We got to tour the mines. We got to see the entire company. And after leaving there, I was blown away by not only the product, but also the company culture they have there. Because we love to support people that make good products. We really love to support people that make good products that have a good company culture as well. And it was incredibly impressive on all accounts. But one thing that was brought up multiple times, prior to that, the only other access to salt we really had in any, or salt sort of experience we had in any of our travels, was when we were in Sicily. We were doing some cheese research in Sicily, and we went to a place called Trapani in the northwest coast of Sicily, not terribly far from Palermo. And these salt flats, like other salt flats in the world, are right next to the sea, and they let in the water, and they're huge, like football field size areas that let in just a little bit of water, very salty water. And over the day, it evaporates. And a lot of times they move it from salt flat to salt flat to salt flat as things fall out of suspension. And they do this to refine the salt. And by the end of it, all you have left is salt, and all the minerals have actually dropped out. And they take the minerals and they sell them to supplement companies and things like this. But at the end of it, you just have salt. But one thing I think people absolutely need to realize is some of these key words we put that are in our dietary sort of mindset are silly words. Like sea salt is a silly word, because every bit of salt in the world, dietary salt that we put into our mouths, is sea salt. It all was in the sea at some point, whether it's a mile underground at Redmond Mine or whether it's a salt flat in Sicily, it's all sea salt. One of the biggest differences is when was it in the sea, right? The stuff in Sicily came out of the sea yesterday. The stuff in Redmond, I don't even know how many millions of years ago it was in the sea. So the things that are in the sea now are also in that salt, right? For better or for worse, and likewise in the past. So it was all sea salt. When was it in the sea? And has it been refined? And what additives have been added to it? And once you sort of look at it from that perspective, salt becomes very clear. I want salt with the highest mineral content from an ancient sea, if at all possible, with no additives whatsoever. So things like Himalayan salt is great. Redmond's is great. I mean, there's more than just those two, but those really, really come to mind as. And then the only other thing to really consider with salt, and I know this conversation is about salt, but I did a deep dive into salt recently. Salt is one of those really interesting things that when we're making a decision about what we should cook with or how should we include things in our diets, our filters we should think about more things than we typically do. And one of them is, what's the experience of eating it? Salt is such a poster child for this, because the shape and size of the salt genuinely impacts the experience of consuming that salt. And this is my example I always use. The first time I made mint chocolate chip ice cream many, many years ago, I was so excited. I had raw milk, raw cream. I went out and I got like the highest quality mint extract to use. It was all ready to go. I had my little home ice cream maker and I'm making it. But the one thing I forgot, at the very end, you have to add the chocolate into it. I'm like, oh my God, I don't have any chocolate. What am I going to do? And the only thing we had in our cupboard, this is years ago, we don't have it in our cupboard now, but we had told Toll House morsels, you put in chocolate chip cookies. I had a bag of those. So I threw those in and made it. And I'm all excited about my ice cream. And that night after dinner, I said, okay, family, we're going to have ice cream. And I handed it out. And the first thing that the family noticed was that it wasn't green because I didn't add any coloring to it. But they got over that pretty quickly. And then they started eating it. And I could tell by their faces, it went into their mouth and they had a smile. And then all of a sudden they had this confused look for a minute. I'm like, what's wrong? I'm like, I don't know, but I can't put my finger on it, but something's wrong. And I've realized what it was. It was the chocolate. It wasn't that the chocolate was any different quality. It was the shape of the chocolate. Mint chocolate chip ice cream has thin slabs of chocolate that have a little bit of a bite for a second, and then it has so much surface area it melts on your tongue. But the Toll House morsels were just these morsels, right? And you crunch and crunch and crunch and crunch. The experience was different. When we started making sourdough pretzels for our sourdough bakery, the first thing we did was put kosher salt on them. That's all that I had. And even though chemically it's the same thing as pretzel salt, it's sodium chloride, the experience of eating that pretzel wasn't the same. You eat our pretzels now, we put pretzel salt on it. It has a specific shape. It's sodium chloride. It's exactly the same thing, but the act of eating it, how it feels in your mouth is different because of the shape of it. And we know there's things like mold-on salt and all those other things. So the highest quality mineral salt, most ancient sea possible, with the shape that makes the most sense, with absolutely no additives whatsoever, is exactly what we look for now.
Coming back to our ancestors in salt, there's 3 different areas I can think of off the top of my head they may have wanted to use it for: preservation, nutrition, and taste. Do we know if those were all reasons they used it? And then are there any others?
I have no idea that answer, except I cannot imagine a world. Food is so, and we've talked about this before, food permeates everything that we are as humans. The experience of preparing and eating and sharing food is a uniquely human thing. And it's a powerful, powerful thing. And it's not a new powerful thing. I consider this to be a very ancient, powerful thing. And I cannot imagine that our ancestors cared any less than we do today about qualities of that experience, like taste and texture and aroma and those sorts of things. So I'm convinced that it had to be a part of all of that. Well, we know we need it for preservation. There's no doubt. But the taste part, I'm sure. The only other thing I could add to that probably is, and I'll bring up Redmond's as an example. When I only knew Redmond before we went out there as a source of high quality, incredibly nutritious salt for humans. I didn't have any idea until they started talking to us that a large part of their company is creating things for animals, for animals that we've raised. But then when we went on the tour, we went into the first thing we saw, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, is they were packaging up all the salt blocks that go to Cabela's and Bass Pro Shop for hunters to put out into the woods. I cannot imagine a world in which that also wasn't a part of it for our ancestors, that understood that animals need salt just as much as humans do, and it wasn't a way to actually get animals to come to a certain place. That said, I'll also give you another very quick example. We were doing some research in West Pokot, Kenya, on a yogurt, this stuff called Mursic, this ancestral ash yogurt. And on the way there, we met some archaeologists who invited us to see a site that they were working on. It was at a place called Mount Elbin, I believe it was called. And they took us to a cave. And this cave was a huge cave. But the cave, turns out, it was built by elephants over thousands of years. And the reason the elephants built this, literally mined this cave out, this huge cave, was because it had such mineral-rich, part of it was sodium chloride, salt, but this mineral-rich earth that the mountain was built on. So they spent over thousands of years with their tusks. They were, digging away this mineral-rich earth and consuming it. And they went there every day. And the reason that it's important to this conversation is because when poaching was a thing still, it was a place that poachers would go, and they'd go over top of the cave, and every single day the elephants would come and they would shoot these elephants. So they knew that these animals were coming to the salt and the other minerals on a regular basis. So I'm confident that salt was probably used in the past as well as a source of successful hunting.
It's obvious you've went deep into this salt topic. And we've talked about when it comes to plants and animals, the importance of diversity. You're obviously a fan of this Redmond salt now that you've been there and seen everything that goes on behind the scenes. Because there are so many different salts out there from so many different places, do you feel it's necessary to have different ones at different times? Or is finding one like Redmond's and just going all in on it enough?
That is a fantastic question. From a nutritional, I'm not the person to ask for this, but I'll still give you my take on it. From a nutritional perspective, I think finding an incredibly high quality source like Redmond is sufficient from a nutritional perspective. But we have the other part of the equation is we have some companies that are doing a really, really, really good job of creating great resources for us in our food system and literally bucking the system and trying very hard. And it's not, I'm from somebody who owns a restaurant right now trying to do the same thing. It is not an easy task. So I would suggest that if you find different salt or any other resource supplier that's doing a great job, I think it's important from an economic perspective to spread the wealth out a little bit and support as many as you possibly can. Because we are literally fighting an uphill battle. We are fighting a multi-trillion-dollar industry in order to make these changes. So again, I love Redmond. I love Redmond because it is a very high quality product, and I love Redmond because it is an incredible company with an incredible company culture. We will still continue to support other ones as well, but I think that's a very important thing to do, not necessarily from a nutritional perspective, but from another perspective. And the final thing, and I only touched on this briefly, but this is really, really, really important. If you're like, fine, I get it, but I'm not really there with the salt right now. Fine, I get it. We have to take these steps as they become available to us. But look at the salt that you buy. I don't care what the labeling's like. I don't care if it comes from Whole Foods or not. Turn it around and look at the back of it. The only thing that should be on that label is salt. If there's anything else on there, we don't need anti-caking agents. We don't need anything on there whatsoever except for salt. Even if it says sea salt on the front and has a beautiful picture, turn it around and look on the back of it. At the very least, do your body a favor and make sure there are no preservatives or no anti-caking agents. There's nothing in there besides pure salt.
How do you feel about iodine being added to salt? Because your typical table salt, it seems like that's a standard thing. And from what I've heard, iodine in the diet these days is pretty hard to come by. So a couple different pieces there. Iodized salt, and then how you think about iodine.
The 19-teens and the 1920s, and even bleeding into the 1930s, I know we have an incredibly poor diet right now. Like we are, and many would consider this an all-time low for the modern American diet. And for certain things it is. But I will tell you, those decades in the early 1900s saw some of the biggest deficiencies we've ever had in our country. And it's the same time when we start seeing all this fortification of food in our food system. It's when we start fortifying baked goods with niacin, for example. It's the same time we start fortifying salt with iodine. Was it 1920s? I forget the exact year that it happened. And it happened in the Midwest. And the reason it happened is because our diets were becoming less and less and less diverse, and especially in the middle part of our country where we didn't have access to seafood, iodine wasn't in the diet, and people had a huge iodine deficiency. So the knee-jerk reaction from our country was not to improve the food system; it was to put iodine in the salt because salt was consumed so widely. There's several problems with that. One is we can sufficiently get iodine, and we can get iodine in a better, more digestible, more bioavailable form if we get it from food. One of the best sources of iodine is seaweed, period. And it doesn't take a whole lot in order to fortify. One of the things we do here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen is we have bone broth on tap, and one of the things we offer on it is some dulse, which is one of my favorite seaweeds. Most of it comes from Ireland. You can get it from other places. You can get it incredibly high quality stuff right off Amazon, and put some of that on your bone broth in the morning every day, or whatever hot beverage you're consuming. And that is a great way to do it. I forget the exact number. I'm not an iodine expert. I would make sure I went to other sources of information, but somewhere around 80% of the iodine in iodized salt is not even usable by the body anyhow. The problem, and again, I'm not the person to ask because I'm not an iodine expert. I'm worried about iodine supplementation without consultation with somebody that does know about iodine, because while it's very difficult to overdose on iodine from food sources and practically impossible to do from salt, it is possible to do with supplements if the available form of iodine you're taking with supplements is fully bioavailable. So iodine is incredibly essential to our bodies. I believe if we have a diverse diet with the right foods, we can get it from our diets in most cases. But if you're going to supplement with it, from what I understand, I would make sure that I'm referring to somebody that knows a lot about it to understand which I should take and what I should take. But I don't believe iodine in salt is something that we should be paying attention to anymore. And I've never had iodized salt in my diet my entire life, and it's definitely not in our restaurant.
We did talk about your diet last time, but by the sounds of it, hearing you talk today, you're eating heavily animal-based, nose to tail, Redmond salt or other sea salts, seaweed in the form of dulse. Any other major players in there that I've left out? And then any supplements you use on a regular basis to add to that?
I do include a lot of dairy in my diet. I don't drink milk. I certainly don't eat cereal. So I have full fat fermented dairy is in my diet on a very, very regular basis. So and that's in the form of traditional raw milk cheeses. It's in the form of kefir, in the form of really high quality yogurt, in the form of really high quality butter, fermented butter if possible. So I do believe that is an incredibly powerful food resource for most humans if it's processed properly. But like any other food, we're talking about within that same category are things I would never ever put in my body. Right? They're ultra pasteurized, homogenized skim milk. I don't believe has any should never cross our lips. Like it's not a food, but high quality whole raw milk, non-homogenized is certainly something that is wonderful. A fermented version of that is, in my mind, even a step better. I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but there's only two traditional groups in the world that I know of that drink milk. One is a Samburu and one is the Maasai. They drink blood and milk every single day. But other than that, no traditional group drinks milk. That's not a traditional thing. It's always in a fermented state. And if you take raw milk and just leave it on the counter and don't even touch it, it naturally ferments. The fermentation process is replicating what happened in us and every other mammal when we're infants and drinking from our mothers. It's what happened inside of our bodies. So replicating that process to create traditional cheeses, kefir, yogurt, clabber, that sort of thing, fermented butter is just an act of doing that technology, using that technology outside of our bodies before we consume it. And that is, in my mind, the safest, most nutrient-dense, bioavailable, delicious way to consume dairy. So I do consume dairy. We mentioned earlier, nose to tail. I don't count, and I'm not suggesting it's good or bad. I had a very orthorexic relationship with food for most of my life, which meant I was literally counting every single calorie, fat gram, whatever, to the gram, and forcing myself to eat a certain way because my mind or Muscle and Fitness magazine or whatever I was using when I was a kid was telling me to do this no matter what my body was saying. And because of that, I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with food, but now it has changed. And I am in a place in my life where I am fully connected to my food. I forage, I hunt, I fish, I butcher, I make everything from scratch. My relationship with food is now at a place where I feel I can intuitively eat and do it in a very healthy way. Now, I'm not suggesting other people who have found a lot of success in counting their macro and micronutrients. I'm not suggesting you should stop. But for me, I've stopped because it reminds me of a time in my life that that was a dark relationship with food. I eat most of the vegetables I eat are fermented, and all of the vegetables I eat fall in the low or medium oxalate level range. Nothing in the high range. What else? Alcohol. I don't think we talked about alcohol, but alcohol is a very hot topic right now. I'll tell you what we do here at the restaurant, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at home. But I do believe, I know, I'm confident that alcohol has been in our diet well before even meat was in our diet. And we can dive deep into this, but there is something called the drunken monkey hypothesis, which suggests that all mammals will seek out alcohol whenever possible. And it's true. It's hardwired into us. And there's some very important reasons why. But to suggest that alcohol is a new thing in our diets is false. Alcohol is, at the level it's at in our diets, is very new. Fully distilled alcohol is new. Mixed cocktail drinks is new. But alcohol, especially in a wild fermented form, has been in our diets for millions of years. So that's not to suggest whether it's healthy or not. But if you're looking for an ancestrally appropriate approach to food, and you're excluding alcohol because you believe our ancestors never had it, I would argue with you about that. That's not to suggest it's healthy or not. That's where we are with that. So what we've done here at the restaurant, and what we do at home as well, is we have taken a very similar approach to alcohol as we have with food. So what we're saying is, we're meeting people where they are. And like, for example, we have a sourdough bakery here. I don't eat hardly any bread whatsoever. Whenever I do, it's sourdough, but we have it because for some people, they want to come in here and eat full carnivore. Some people come in here and they're full carnivore, but their husband isn't and their kids definitely aren't. So, what we're doing is we're making familiar food as nourishing as it can possibly be by implementing all these traditional approaches. So we have things like sourdough and the like for them. Same sort of thing with alcohol. What we've done is we've set up a criteria of this is what we will do and never do with alcohol. And for those of you who continue to include alcohol in your diets, I think there's some really key takeaways here. Number one, the category of wine is a huge category. Everything from, $4 a bottle Boone's Farm from the local convenience store all the way to $300 bottles of wine. So just like with bread and any other category of food, there's a huge spectrum of things that we call wine. Some of them, I would argue, could be a part of a healthy diet when consumed in the right way, and some of them should never cross our lips. You can have 96 additives in a bottle of wine in this country that do not have to be on the label. 96 additives in a bottle of wine. And that could be a $300 bottle of wine. The price doesn't necessarily make a difference for that. The growing, like everything else, the growing practices of the grapes, how they're processed, all of those things impact whether or not it's something that I would consider worthy of putting in my lips. So we restrict ourselves to regeneratively grown and harvested grapes that have been spontaneously wild fermented and have been done in a traditional way with no additives. So we actually import all of our wine from the Republic of Georgia, which has the oldest traditional grape tradition in the world. They're actually wild fermented in these clay things called querbies in the ground. It's brilliant. So all of our wine meets those standards. All of our beer is sour beer. It's local sour beer. Every single loaf of bread from 8,600 years ago into the mid-1800s was a sourdough loaf of bread, which meant it had a wild yeast and bacterial fermentation happening side by side. And every single bottle, can, jar, leather pouch of beer ever made for thousands of years also was a sour beer that had both of those fermentations. So we only serve sour beers. And as far as hard alcohol is concerned, and this is, I think, a very important one, there are a lot of biohackers and other people in the health field that suggest that distilled alcohol is the cleanest way to consume alcohol. And they make a point. Now, distilled alcohol isn't ancestrally appropriate because there was no distillation that long ago, but there is a point when you compare that distilled alcohol to most of the commercially available wines and beers and things today, which have all kinds of nonsense in them. Again, remember that the wine and the beer that I'm talking about are different wines and beers, but distilled alcohol is a very, very clean thing. The problem comes in when you start mixing drinks and making cocktails, because all of a sudden you're flooding it with artificial colors and flavors and tons of nasty sugars and all these other things that we shouldn't consume in our diets whatsoever. And then as soon as you start drinking and you lose your ability to think properly, you start consuming more of them, and then it becomes a real issue. So what we decided here, and the same thing I would suggest for somebody at home, is if you're going to consume hard alcohol, distilled versions of these things are very clean. If you're going to have a cocktail, then get the highest quality distilled alcohol possible and make anything you're going to put into it. So everything that we have here, we're making all of our vermouths, we're making our Campari, we're making all of our Amaros, we're making our tonics. All of that is made very traditionally. We're making it in-house using the same standards that we have. So you could even come here, and again, I'm not suggesting you have a mixed drink, but if you're going to have a mixed drink, what you have here is a completely different food than the mixed drink you're going to have at TGI Fridays, and it'll meet certain standards.
All right, let's come back to the drunken monkey hypothesis. This is something that's new to me.
Okay.
You mentioned the fact that animals out in the wild will seek out alcohol, and you mentioned some important reasons for that. So what are those? Okay.
I don't know if we got to, I forget if we talked the last time we talked, but fruit, the role of a fruit is to attract an animal when the seeds are mature, to eat the fruit, ingest the seeds. The seeds are chemically and physically designed to withstand the digestive tract of the animal, and sometimes require it through a process called scarification in order to even germinate at some point. And then they deposit the seeds in a pile of manure, the perfect situation somewhere over here, and then the plant continues to propagate and it has babies. So this only works when the seeds are mature. And in almost all fruits, there's a level of toxin, in some cases very high toxins, prior to the seeds becoming mature. And they're dangerous and they're problematic. And then when because they don't want the seeds to get eaten before they're mature, because if the seeds are eaten before they're mature, then there's no chance of them growing into an adult plant. This is a coevolutionary process over millions and millions and millions of years, and it works really, really well. So unripe fruits are dangerous. Ripe fruits are less dangerous or not dangerous whatsoever. The toxin mechanism is turned off in almost all cases. It smells sweet, it tastes sweet, it attracts animals, and then the animal eats it and whatever. The suggestion of the drunken monkey hypothesis, and this is a hypothesis that was put forth by an anthropologist at University of California, Berkeley. He wrote a great book called The Drunken Monkey Hypothesis, or it's just called The Drunken Monkey, I think. It's a fantastic read. And his suggestion is the only way, there's an evolutionary mechanism that allows mammals to know when that fruit is at its safest. Its most safe, low toxin, nutrient available form. And that's when it's actually started through this fermentation process. And it will not ferment until that toxin is turned off and all the sugars are in a state to start fermenting. And it will spontaneously ferment. The fruits will fall off the tree, they'll hit the ground, the sugars will be exposed, it'll start fermenting. It has a particular aroma and it'll attract an animal, and an animal will go there because it knows that it's at its safest form. This is at least the suggestion for the hypothesis. And it's true. I mean, this happens on a regular basis in the wild. And you can Google or hit YouTube on drunken monkey hypothesis, and you'll see all these drunk animals. The example I usually give is a giraffe looks silly anyhow. A sober giraffe is silly. A drunk giraffe is one of the funniest things you've ever seen in your life. So this does happen. And this started, I think part of his thinking was, one of the questions people typically have is, okay, I get these kind of coevolutionary mechanisms, but why the heck are people attracted to sugar? Like, why are they attracted to sugar? And the suggestion for that is there's nothing in nature that's sweet that's toxic. So if it's sweet, it's safe, and they equal out. And we have this, but something sweet in nature is scarce compared to the sweets that we have today. So we never had that sort of need to shut this mechanism down that attracts us to sugar. And the same sort of idea here with the drunken monkey hypothesis, the idea that Okay, if it's fermenting, then it's safe for us to eat, at least from whatever that other toxin was, right? But at the same time, we're not talking about distilled alcohol. We're not talking about the ability to go to the corner liquor store and buy 3 cases of beer and all of a sudden send yourself to the hospital because you have alcohol poisoning. It's impossible to do, I think, using just natural wild fruit fermenting on the ground. Could you get a little bit of a buzz? Probably. Are you going to end up in the hospital? Probably not. So we now have these, we're living in caveman bodies in a modern world with different resources available to us in different quantities. Whether it's we can eat bags of shelled almonds and give ourselves oxalate toxicity, or whether we can drink, a gallon of vodka and wind up dead. We have a different cultural system that we're working in, but we still have these senses that are very, very, very ancient.
One beverage that a lot of people in the health world are drinking, and I know your morning actually involved kombucha. How do you feel about it? Obviously, you're picking some up or involved in it somehow this morning. Talk about that, and then how you feel about that in the health world.
I love kombucha for a few reasons. One is because, I just love the taste of it when it's done well. I love the fact that it's full of all sorts of live things. There's not enough live things, obviously, in our diets. The only concerns that I have for kombucha, and again, there is another resource that does have alcohol. Now, it's a very, very minuscule amount, but same thing. We think it's strange, a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, but the bacteria and yeast fermentations have always happened side by side naturally. And the fact that we have separated them from one another, and the fact we can buy a package of yeast at the grocery store and make bread and leaven the bread without the bacterial fermentation is a brand new thing in the history of the world. So it's very common. So that sort of fermentation that involves both of them is a very common thing. I love the taste of it. I love the fact that it's filled with probiotics. The 2 concerns that I have with kombucha are, if you have a sensitivity to oxalates, I would find out what teas that they're being made from. So if the basis of the tea is black tea, then it's probably not the kombucha that you want to ingest in high amounts if you have an issue with oxalates. The cool thing is, as more people are experimenting with kombucha, they're realizing they don't need these high oxalate teas in order to form the basis of the kombucha. And that people are doing them now with all sorts of herbal teas, and some people are doing them with Yaupon holly. Do you know Yaupon holly?
No.
Okay, Yaupon holly is a really cool plant. It is the only plant native to Eastern North America that has caffeine. And it was used traditionally for a very long period of time. We know the Cherokee Indians drank it. And it was part of a ritual that they would create. So it was also called the black drink. And what they would do is they would fast for days and days and days and days and days, and then they would brew an incredibly strong batch of this Yaupon holly tree and tea made from it. And then they would drink massive quantities of it. And because of the fact they were coming out of the fast, had fasted for so long, and this huge influx of caffeine, I mean, they would hallucinate and do all these things. It was part of a ritual. I don't know exactly what happened with it, but it was very important to them. The cool thing about this tea is that it tastes delicious. It does have caffeine for those of us who want caffeine, and it has no oxalates in it. It's an amazing combination for those of us who want to drink tea, want to get caffeine, and don't want all those oxalates. And the other kind of cool side of it is it has the genus and species of the actual plant is Ilex vomitorius. And the reason is because if you ingest the berries, you'll actually throw up. So anyhow, to make a very long story short, that tea can be used to make kombucha. And that is a great basis for kombucha. So one of my concerns, if you're selecting kombucha, is if you have an issue with oxalates, understand what tea they're using as a base. Green tea is a little bit better than black tea as far as oxalates are concerned. Secondly, how much residual sugar is in it? Because we get into this idea that we categorize things healthy or not healthy, and most of us would categorize kombucha in the healthy side. But there's a lot of junk kombucha out there as well that if it's been fermented long enough, the available sugars, most of them or all of them have been eaten by the bacteria and the yeast through the fermentation. But if not, or if they're secondarily fermented, or if they're adding a bunch of other things at the end after the fermentation, then you can have a very sweet kombucha and you're getting as much sugar as you're drinking another kind of a soft drink. So again, like anything else, you can make a better version of just about any of these foods in your own home and control all of those things at the same time. But I do like good kombucha. We get our kombucha from Hex Ferments in Baltimore, and they're awesome.
While we're on the topic of sugar, let's talk about that from an ancestral perspective. I'd have to imagine in our past we would have had access to honey, wild fruits, but when it came to the fruit piece, did we ever juice those, dehydrate that down into a sugar-like substance?
That's, again, hard to answer, but I'll tell you what I do know. Yeah, honey was absolutely available in areas where honey was being made by bees. However, honey is one of those few things that there's still if we're buying true, real, genuine honey, the cost of that honey reflects how difficult it is to get the honey. There's a lot of things through subsidies and all that. I mean, sugar is so cheap, it doesn't reflect the amount of labor that it takes to actually make that sugar. And we have this idea that, we should have a lot of it because it's so cheap. But honey at least does reflect that. So with that, in that same, line of thinking, the traditional groups that I've spent time with, and right now I'm thinking especially the Hadza. So the Hadza are the oldest hunter-gatherer group in the world. I was living with them in Tanzania prior to filming the first episode of The Great Human Race. And on one occasion, we went and harvested some honey. For the entire time we were there, we harvested it once. And everybody came out and everybody wanted the honey. There wasn't that much honey. So everybody ate some honey, and then they weren't going to have honey again for weeks. And this was actually a hive that they knew of, and they were waiting for us to come to harvest it. I mean, it's a very big deal. So when we think of, those of us who are, again, eating in an ancestrally appropriate way or eating carnivore, and because we're carnivore, if it comes from an animal, we can have it. So honey is part of the diet. They're not having a tablespoon of honey every day. that isn't happening. They're having some honey, then they're having no honey again for a long time. It's kind of like my mother-in-law would tell me all the time how the only time she had sweets at all was on Halloween, on Christmas, and every now and then her parents would give her a dime or whatever to go to the, in South Philly, to go to the candy store. Like, was there candy in the 1950s? Absolutely, but nowhere near what it is today. So yes, they had access to honey where honeybees were making honey, right? Or bees were making honey, but it wasn't in our diets all the time. The thing about fruits is very interesting. Remember, we started this conversation talking about the genetic mutations that have taken place in our produce, and one of the big genetic mutations that have taken place is in fruits. We are breeding fruits to be bigger. We are breeding fruits to be sweeter. We're breeding fruits to have smaller seeds. In some cases, we're breeding fruits. I mean, think about how unnatural this is. We are breeding fruits to not even have seeds, like watermelons. It's a very strange thing. The fruits we have in our diets today do not resemble in any form whatsoever the wild fruits that our ancestors had access to, or that traditional or indigenous people around the world have access to, except for in a couple of select locations. I remember the same trip when we were kind of actually not far from where that elephant cave was. One of the people that was in our group was a forager, a local forager in that area, and they grabbed this little thing off a tree. It was about this big. It was the size of maybe a small grape, maybe a cherry. It was the size of a cherry. And this is a wild orange. Like, come on. I'm like, no, seriously, it's a wild orange. Let's try it. And I did. And the only thing I could compare it to was, if you've ever had a kumquat. You ever had a kumquat and eat the whole thing?
Yeah, they're good.
They're good. But they're a little bit bitter compared to a navel orange, right? This thing was a kumquat on steroids. You could tell it was orange. The orange flavor of an orange was really, really strong. Like they dipped it in orange extract or something. But the seeds were massive. There was hardly any flesh, and it was incredibly bitter. It was not sweet. And when I remember almost every instance of being out foraging for most wild fruits, That's the same thing. The pits or the seeds are huge. There's hardly any flesh. They're not very sweet. If in some cases not sweet at all. And it is a completely different thing than what we're used to. So is it a source of some sweetness? Absolutely. And especially if you have hardly any sweets or anything sweet in your diet, would this probably seem even sweeter? Absolutely. But the amount of carbohydrates coming into your diet from them would be very, very low. I don't know of another source of sweetness except the only other source of sugar that I can even imagine having access to would be milk. It would be the lactose in milk, which again, if you have really good, amazing, high quality milk, like if anybody's had raw milk from a well-raised animal, directly from that animal, it is actually sweet, especially if you're not used to having sweets in your diet. It is actually sweet. So that's the only other source of sweetness I can even think of.
Do we have any evidence of ancestors taking fruit juice? Given what you just said, it's not going to be like what we have today where there's all kinds of juice and it's very sweet. But whatever fruit they had at that time, or even like sugarcane, juicing these and then drying it out to make a sugar-like substance to travel with?
Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The only thing I would say is if you got all that fruit juice, and again, remember, it would be incredibly difficult. It's not like juicing oranges from the grocery store. It would be very difficult to get that amount of juice. But as soon as you had that juice, it would start fermenting. So you'd have to play this rush game. And in fact, to be honest, I bet you the alcohol was more important to them than the potential portable sugar that would have come out of it. But again, I don't know that answer.
Okay, so we went into your diet. I gave the lay of the land. You added dairy, alcohol, kombucha. Any other pieces before we close that?
I just want to, again, qualify the alcohol part of this. My wife and I enjoy a glass of wine. Like we rarely drink hard alcohol. And if we do, it's really high quality alcohol and it's for a special occasion. I don't drink hardly any beer anymore. When I do, it's all sour, but I don't drink a lot of beer, but we do truly enjoy a glass of wine. And I just even today was listening to on social media, people on both. It's just like everything else. It's become so polarized. You're either completely dry or you're considered an alcoholic when it comes to alcohol. And it's like everything else. Carnivore, vegan, or all these things are really separating us. And I truly believe there's, in many cases, well-intentioned, loud voices on both sides of this. But the majority of the public listening to this is somewhere in the middle and incredibly confused. I am not suggesting that you need alcohol to be healthy, or alcohol should be a part of your diet from a nutritional perspective. But like everything else, that when I remember, I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with food for so long. Luckily, I don't believe I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with alcohol, but I did go to college. I was a part of that scene for a little bit as well. But where I've landed is I enjoy food. I enjoy life. I love foraging. I love hunting. I love going to the farmer's market. I love cooking, especially if somebody else is there with me. I love cooking for people. I love the act of sitting down and sharing food. All of those things I just mentioned to me are just as important as how much protein and fat and carbohydrates may or may not be in the food that I'm serving. So that's an incredibly important part of this. When we think about alcohol, for those of us who have the opportunity, because I know for some people having a healthy relationship with alcohol is an impossible thing, but for those of us who can have a healthy relationship with alcohol, I would consider giving yourself some grace and understanding that first, just like every other category of food, there's a huge diversity within anything like wine or beer or drinks that, some of this stuff is a lot healthier than another one. So if you can find those sources of alcohol, the act of sitting down and having a high quality glass of wine and the conversation that follows with somebody that you love or whatever is an incredibly powerful act and is something to think about it in a different way than these large voices that are yelling at us, back and forth. Again, I'm not suggesting we should drink. I'm not suggesting we should drink every day. I'm not suggesting we drink once a week. What I am suggesting is everybody needs to find their own path with this and to understand there are more options than just all in or all out for a lot of this. And for most of us who are navigating an incredibly complex world, everybody's path is a little bit different.
All right. You're somebody who is very conscious and intentional about what you're eating, how you're processing it. You're eating nose to tail. Given all that, are there any supplements you need to take on a regular basis to round that out?
I do in the winter take a D3K2 supplement. I have in the past, I'm not right now. I do think magnesium supplementation is probably a very important thing for a lot of people. As far as supplements are concerned, that is most of what my regimen has been. But if you asked me 5 years ago, what do you think about supplements? I would have said, you don't need them. We don't need them. We can get everything we need from food. Look at what our ancestors have been doing for millions of years. I have significantly backed away from that line of thinking. And part of the reason is because even the most well-intentioned of us have nowhere near the access to the high quality food that our ancestors had access to. It is different food, especially and we had this conversation a little bit earlier today of, if the only meat you have access to is the CAFO meat, it's a different meat, right? It's still better than another choice, but it is still the CAFO meat compared to an animal that's been raised on the diet that they were designed to consume. So I think, and for so many of us as well, even if we have access to the highest quality ingredients, there's something going on. I mean, for some of us, we've had 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years worth of poor diet that we're trying to crawl out from underneath. That is almost impossible to do with just food sometimes. So I do think there's a lot of errors in the supplement industry. I think there's a lot of supplements out there that we probably have no business taking, or even if we did, the people that are creating them are creating terrible versions of them. But I do think, and I don't know enough about it to tell you what's the best and what's the worst, but the more that I'm listening to people that I really, really, really trust, that certain supplements probably make a lot of sense, especially in today's dietary landscape, and especially when we're trying to regain health after decades of poor diets.
Early in the conversation, we talked about different qualities of meat, different types of meat. Mm-hmm. And we went from one end of the continuum to the other, from CAFO all the way to grass-fed, grass-finished beef. How do you feel about this new meat that's coming? Might already be here. I don't follow it too closely. Factory-grown meat.
When we were 7 years ago now, I think, maybe 6 years ago, we were living in Ireland. There was a big program, and they went to they did this thing at these farms, and they asked me to go out, and I butchered a pig during the program, and then they had this sort of sit down, and they asked me a question like that, and I was not prepared for it, but I answered it the best that I could. I still feel the same way. I think it's horrible on every single level. From a nutritional level, my problem is we get fooled into thinking, we have this hubris all the time that we know everything there is to know about something now. But if you go back 5 years, we knew even less. And 5 years before that, like what we know, the qualities in something like meat, we do not know all of the things that are in there. So number one, in order to replicate something artificially that is as complex as meat, you'd have to already know all the things that are in there and how they operate, and which we don't. I would bet everything that I have on the fact that we do not fully comprehend everything that's in something like meat. So it's impossible to fully replicate it. And then can we fully replicate it? Probably not. But another thing that I don't think people are necessarily talking about with it or thinking about when they consider something like these artificially produced meats is it is one more, at least, link in a food chain. It's separating us from where our food is coming from. And anything that separates me from where my food is coming from is a sense of loss, a sense of misunderstanding, a sense of disempowerment, and allows somebody else to control what I'm eating and the decisions that I'm making for myself and my family and my community. So even if we knew everything about meat, which we don't, even if we could fully replicate what those things are, which I'm confident we can't, I still would resist it because it is one more separation between me and where my food is coming from. And I think that's one of the worst things that's happened in our dietary past. And it's one of the things that I'm working very hard to regain.
All right, Bill, as we come to a close, one other area I want to make sure we dive into is the blue zones. And you're somebody who is really qualified to talk about this. And I think it's really important we have the counter arguments and points because this has taken such a stronghold in modern society, especially with the more recent Netflix docuseries, which I haven't actually watched, but I know a lot of people were talking about it. And you, as an archaeologist, somebody who's traveled the world, spent time with these different people, and you've been to Sardinia, which is the original blue zone, I'd like to get your opinion. So let's start with your story to Sardinia, when that was, and what the diet was like.
We went to Sardinia. We had to actually, the place in Sardinia we were at, spent a lot of time at, was actually the epicenter of the first blue zone ever identified. It was not only in that same, in Sardinia, it was actually in the same village. So I feel well-versed to talk about at least that experience. What we experienced there was the exact opposite from a food perspective as what's portrayed as typical of the blue zones. So, and we did watch as much as I could handle the Netflix special, and I couldn't do it anymore, but we watched the one on Sardinia, and I think one of the other ones, I couldn't take it anymore. This is what we experienced. We experienced people that were so incredibly connected to their food that every single meal we ate was, the ingredients were created and sourced by people that were sitting at the table. They were all prepared by people sitting at the table. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Like I couldn't believe places like that still existed. I mean, certainly with tribes and groups who are in the middle of the bush somewhere, absolutely. But I mean, we were in a village, a proper village. Some would even consider it a small city or at least a town on the side of this mountain, cars driving everywhere, modern homes. And we're sitting in these kitchens, sitting down to a meal, full-fledged meal, multi-course meals. And every ingredient in there was grown or harvested by somebody sitting at that table and 100% prepared. The meats, the cheeses, all breads, all of it by people sitting at that table. So that was the first part of it. The second part of it was you'd be hard-pressed to find a vegetable at most of these meals. Like they existed, but as side pieces. The only vegetables we consumed were, in some of these you could obviously imagine, we had some tomatoes, we had olives, we had eggplant, we had garlic, we had basil, probably onions, although I don't remember it specifically. And that was it. Meanwhile, we had sheep and the entirety of the sheep. Like it'd be hard for you to sit down at a meal and eat meat and not see all the other parts of the animal on the table. So the first big meal we had, they have these really cool spits they make with motors that do windshield wipers on cars, and they make these rotisserie things that every home had an outdoor sort of fireplace grill like thing, and they had this meat spinning, and it was this literally huge spit, and half of it was a huge shoulder of this animal, and the other half were all the intestines wrapped around like this, and this is sitting there going like this. Every time we sat down at a table, somebody was so proud. They brought out a whole bunch of their homemade cheeses and a whole bunch of their cured meats. Literally, you would go, if you went to a house in another part of the world, they'd bring out a bag of potato chips or cheese and crackers. It was meat and cheese, literally every single place that we went, every single time we sat down at another house. It was unbelievable. The experiences, we were there to learn how to make a certain kind of cheese called caio de cabretto, which is made from unweaned goat stomachs. But we harvested these goats and then all of a sudden literally proceeded to make these extravagant dishes using the entirety of the goat. I mean, literally the bones, the marrow, the intestines, the intestinal contents, all the organs, the meat, the head, all of it was prepared and consumed in certain ways. So from a food perspective, it was literally the exact opposite of what's being portrayed. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was that extravagantly different. But what I will say is what we found about the rest of their lifestyle was very similar to what was being reported. There was a lot of exercise, just walking all the time. The way people dealt with each other was fantastic. In fact, I asked multiple people, I said, hey, you know about this blue zone thing? They're like, yeah, we heard it. I said, what's the key? What's the key? And every one of them said, we're nice to each other. I mean, it was brilliant, and they are. So what I loved to see was, okay, first off, the way that we're approaching food here was directly in line with the way that they're actually eating. Everything from the actual ingredients themselves to their own time investment and connection with their raw materials and also the food production and processing itself. But that it wasn't just about the food. It was about the fact that they're always moving. It was the fact that they're nice to one another. And it's all of the different factors of life that seem to have come together in a place like this to produce not only people that have a lifespan as long as they have, but a health span as long as they have. We regularly saw people over 100 years old that were living completely independently, that were walking up and down the sides of the mountains. I mean, these roads were like steep. Walking, everybody's walking. It was magnificent. It was the way humans should be living, and I'm convinced we can be there. But it takes all of those things to come together at concert at the same time. I will say there is a wine that they have there that is suggested to be this wine of longevity. It's a Canalou grape. And they kind of joke about it, though. They know that it's sort of been branded like this. It is a wine that they drink regularly, but they all kind of joke that it isn't necessarily keeping them living any longer.
When it comes to the food, zoning in on this piece, you mentioned how it's so polar opposite how it's being portrayed by the Blue Zones brand. Any idea how that got so lost in translation? And I'll add to this, we're talking about one of the Blue Zones here. Have you traveled to any of the others?
No, but I have talked to people like Mary Ruddick who have. And other than Loma Linda, which is the Seventh-day Adventist community, which I'm confident, I haven't been there, but I'm confident what's being portrayed from a vegetarian perspective is probably very accurate. All of the rest of them, I have talked to people that have been to the others, and they report a very similar thing that I have.
Any idea why things got so lost in translation?
Oh, I'm confident it was intentional. And in fact, I talked to, one of the things that's portrayed about Sardinia is a massive amount of this minestrone soup, some vegetable-based minestrone soup. And some of the people there, in fact, I was in the home. The meal that I'm mostly referring to as I'm talking to you, that was the centerpiece, their home. BBC came out to do a big special there. And they did it in their home, and they were joking about it the whole time. And they're like, I don't know where this minestrone soup thing came from. Like we eat it, but it's rare that we even eat it. It was so funny. But I'm convinced it was intentional. And there's probably a few places where things are lost in translation. So I'll give you one example. Every single time we visited somebody, every single time we came into somebody's kitchen, I mean, literally, there was not one exception. They tried to bring out meat and some of their cured meats, things like prosciutto or salamis that they made, that sort of thing, from their own animals. They butchered and cured them themselves, and also cheeses that they made. So both of them are animal-based foods every single time. And then on the one Sunday, and then we had other meals, and there was meat and things, but on that one Sunday, we had a barbecue. Like they called it a barbecue, but it was that, big piece of the sheep and all the intestines. And it was a big to do. The entire day was spent making this food, and it was a huge multi-course meal and all this. So a few days later, I said to them, through a translator, remember, so there are things lost in translation, both because of language barriers, but also because of cultural barriers. And the way that we word things truly impacts the way that we view the world. I mean, in very important ways. And this is a significant one. So I said, okay, at the end of the experience that we had at this particular village, I said, all right, how much meat, how many days a week do you actually eat meat? And he said, 1. And I'm like, wait, I've spent how long with you? And we've had meat at every single meal. He's like, no, that's not meat. Sunday night, that was meat. The barbecue, that was meat. Like, what are you talking about? And the way they interpreted that question was the big to-do, the big barbecue, the animal on the spit, the intestines, that whole thing, that to them was meat. But all the other meat they consumed throughout the rest of the week wasn't part of that consciousness. It wasn't part of that equation. They didn't consider that sitting down and having a plate of meat. It's almost like if you know, same thing here. If I said the word barbecue instead, like let's say you ate all sorts of meat all week long and you had ham sandwiches and you had chicken over here and you had this and this and this, but every Sunday you had a full-blown barbecue and all your friends and family came. And I said to you, how many days a week do you barbecue? You'd be like, oh, well, 1. But you ate meat at every single meal. So I don't know. It was only that one instance, but I found it very interesting that when I use the term meat, and I've eaten meat with this family like multiple times, they considered that one day the day that they eat meat. It was interesting.
To me, this could be the most important part of the interview because there is so much momentum behind these books and this docuseries. And there's so much confusion in our world about what to eat. You can only imagine the number of people eating plant-based, vegan, because they're hearing about these people living the longest and, you know, seeing these beautiful landscapes a lot of times in different parts of the world where these people are living. And it's just so picturesque. So I think it's important, somebody who's actually been to one of these and talked to other people that have visited these sites, to see that there's more to the story.
Yeah, there's a lot more. And I will say they drank wine and they ate bread. And it was interesting to me to see that as well. And I'm not, again, suggesting there's any nutritional requirement for bread in our diets. I'm certainly not suggesting there's any nutritional requirement for wine in our diets. What I am suggesting is these orthorexic, polarizing, top-down soundbite conversations around food that make all of us feel inadequate because they're not reality for so many of us. And even if they do become reality, they're probably short-lived sort of spurts where we can sustain, whether it's a financial or an emotional sort of this approach to diet. The healthiest people in the world were sitting there enjoying, first of all, enjoying every bite of food that they had, but enjoying a little bit of bread, enjoying a little bit of wine, and having this incredibly diverse diet that is what listen, animal-based across the board. They had more fat, meat, organs, intestines, chyme, all of it, and milk and fermented dairy products. Like, it was the basis of everything that we ate. But they also enjoyed some vegetables. They also enjoyed some bread. They also enjoyed some wine, and they did it in a way that allowed them to truly enjoy every part of the experience of sharing food together. And I think it's a model for all of us to look at. Again, I'm not suggesting you start eating bread and start drinking wine. What I am suggesting is there are healthy ways to go about including those foods in our diet if that is a part of your diet.
I did pull this line from Dan Buettner on another interview he did, who's the face behind the Blue Zones. He says here, we made the decision to stay 100% plant-based within the Blue Zone family, which to me is taking away from the credibility of what they're actually seeing. They're making this seem like a business decision to follow this certain dietary framework that fits a certain narrative. Again, you can take what you will from that, but those were his words.
And I'll say this too, to sort of wrap this up, because it's more than just this conversation. This sort of false reporting and false narrative have a lot of ramifications, a lot. And here's an example. So there is a place that I know of that oversees over 700 homeless people. They provide health care, they provide medical care, they provide food, And years ago, when this became a big thing, they made the decision to hire a food service company that was touting, advertising that they followed the Blue Zone approach in the food that they created. So here you have a population of people that could, I would argue, could benefit the most from nourishing food. And you have a food service provider that is providing almost animal-less diets to these people. And I actually went and saw what was being supplied. And it was horrible. I think they had meat once a week in their diets, literally once a week. And it was usually in the form of some kind of farmed fish, tilapia or something like this. The fats that they had a container this big of some sort of vegetable oil that I couldn't recognize. That was the only fat that was going into their diet. It was a very low-fat diet, but the fat that was going in was this horrid vegetable oil. So these narratives become reality for a lot of people. I mean, things like the FDA requirements and regulations, they're not only things that somebody in their home maybe could decide to adopt to feed their family. They become the mandate for schools and for hospitals and for prisons. And again, we're talking about populations that could absolutely benefit from smart, healthy choices. So it's more than just misreporting. It's literally ruining lives and putting structures in place that are going to take us years or decades to crawl out of. And meanwhile, people are suffering.
And last piece I'll add to this too is that in 2020, the Blue Zone brand ended up selling to Adventist Health, who's affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So you can just see how this has become such a business, and it seems like there could be some ties there behind the scenes.
100%. There's no doubt in my mind. So I would say to everybody listening to this, there is the two best things you can do is listen to as many people talk about food as possible, filter it through your own, mind and the way that you view the world and your place in it, and then make your own decisions, because there is no one person that has it all right. And I can promise you, just like 5 years ago, if I was talking about supplements, I've changed my mind on some of these things. I mean, look at somebody like Paul Saladino. Paul Saladino is changing his mind every 3 months about something. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a healthy thing. But recognize that I don't care how well-intentioned the person that you're listening to on a podcast or author that you're reading on a book or dietitian you're listening to, no matter how well-intentioned they are, the landscape is shifting all the time. Our knowledge base is shifting all the time. Food is incredibly political, as you know, and all that's changing a lot of this right now as well. Filter it, and then empower yourself to make your own decisions.
And I just feel it's so important to have the discussions about these different pieces so people can at least see these different ideas. And then if they choose to, they can do their own research and dive deeper into it and realize that the first story that comes at them might not be the full truth or the truth at all.
Absolutely. And then also remember, and maybe I can close with this. I might have said this last time. I fully believe this. The diet that healed you is probably not the diet you should be on for the rest of your life. We need to continue to shift. Making a shift in your diet is not a failure. I know I've talked to so many people, I've even felt this myself, that they've made a dietary choice, they've seen some improvement, and then the idea, you're so excited that this dietary approach has worked for you. You've told all your friends and family, I am now a carnivore, I'm now a keto, whatever it is, and I'm now a vegan, whatever, and you've told everybody, you've identified with this approach, and then now things are starting to happen where you're like, maybe I should adjust this, maybe I should adjust this. And you force yourself into not changing because you've built an identity around it, because you've told other people that you're whatever you are. And that's an incredibly unhealthy way to be. It's kind of like if I remember I lived in Shrewsbury, New Jersey, and I wrestled at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio. And I took that 550-mile drive from the Jersey Shore to Columbus, Ohio, multiple times and back. And I even remember thinking then that is, even if there was, if there was just it was flat and there were no roads, and I thought, could I point my truck in the right direction so that I wouldn't have to turn my steering wheel and I'd end up in Columbus, Ohio? It would be absolutely impossible. I'd have the MapQuest, directions printed out. I'd have to make this turn and this turn and this turn and this turn and this turn. And over, 50 million turns, I'd finally end up at my apartment in Columbus, Ohio. It's like that with diets. There's a 0 chance probability that whatever decision you've made about your diet right now is the exact diet for you for the rest of your life. You're going to have to make a little bit of a change, address the things that are happening there, and then maybe make a little bit of a change. And that isn't a failure. Every one of those steps is a step towards success, and it's a step towards health.
I totally agree with that. And my dietary history totally shows that. So good place to end it. Bill, I appreciate you chatting with you, your book, everything you're putting out there. I really appreciate the information. It's some of my favorite stuff to dig into. We're going to link up your website, your book, everything in the show notes. Thank you for coming back on.
Truly my pleasure. Great to talk with you.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
We are literally the only species on the planet that hires somebody else to tell us what to eat. And we are the sickest we've ever been, despite that, or probably as a result of that. If you are carnivore, if you are keto, if you are vegan, if you are